Understanding Charter Act of 1793 and 1813 is crucial in determining the scope of change that was introduced by the British. But before we understand these Charter Acts, Charter Act of 1793, Charter Act of 1813, we need to understand the background within which these Charter Acts were introduced. In fact, it's a question, why is it that after 1793 up till 1853, the acts were known as Charter Acts? Charter Act of 1793, Charter Act of 1813, Charter Act of 1833, Charter Act of 1853, and subsequent to 1858, we have Indian Councils Act. Why this terminology? What was the significance of it? And how the politics in England were responsible for these acts which were introduced in India. Therefore, it is very important for us to understand the background within which these acts were introduced. So when we talk about advent of British in India, you have to bear in mind that as soon as British rule was established in India, the East India Company came to exercise political authority, administrative functions, revenue aspects. And we all have studied, in fact discussed, how dual government was characterized by maladministration, how dual government was characterized by a complete oppression on the peasantry and the subsequent famine in Bengal. Back in England, the company's servants, with all the loads of money that they had looted from Bengal, they came to England. And this incited a lot of jealousy amongst the traders in England. The traders in England always wanted that some form of share, they also must be allowed to trade in India. However, the East India Company, which had a monopoly rights because of the charter that was introduced by the British Parliament, it always claimed that this monopoly charter was essential in order to safeguard the interests of the shareholders. These shareholders were generally those in the London merchants. In fact, many of the parliamentarians and even the British Crown, it used to have the shares of East India Company. So there was a tug of war between the shareholders of the East India Company and the traders who had just benefited immensely from Industrial Revolution. And then, because of maladministration happening in India due to the company's rule, especially in Bengal, they are also developed a kind of a response against it, reaction against it, especially from the evangelical Christian missionaries. The evangelical Christian missionaries, they were sympathetic, compassionate to the plight of the peasants. Many of the times the peasants, they were flogged, they were made to suffer, they died of hunger because of the policy of the East India Company. So evangelical Christian missionaries, they criticized the greed of the East India Company. But over here also, the evangelicals, although they expressed compassion towards Indian peasantry and Indian masses, but their approach was to propagate Christianity. So when we talk about pressures back in England, establishment of company rule in India, it triggered certain forms of pressures back in England. And these pressures might be summarized as, the first was the pressures by the free traders. Second, these were the evangelicals. The third were the Benthamite reformers. And the fourth were the shareholders. So we see the British Parliament was always subjected to pressure by these four groups. The free traders, they wanted that the monopoly of East India Company must be abolished. The evangelicals, they wanted to propagate, promote Christianity. Benthamite reformers, they wanted to bring about a liberal form of ideological spread in India. The shareholders, they wanted the privileges of the East India Company to continue so that their commercial interests are safeguarded. When we arrive at the Charter Act of 1793, we see that just a decade before, barely 9 years ago, Pitt's India Act of 1784 had been introduced. Pitt's India Act was a major development, as we have discussed. The Pitt's India Act, it defined all the territories that the company had acquired as British Indian possessions. So the Pitt's India Act was the first act declaring the British sovereignty over the territories that had been acquired by the company. And secondly, we already know that Pitt's India Act introduced Board of Control. Now this Charter Act of 1793, it renewed the charter of the East India Company. So the Charter Act of 1793 renewed the charter that had been introduced for 20 years. Why is this important? Because the moment the charter is renewed for 20 years, it means that a time limit has been prescribed, has been defined. Now the company is not going to possess British Indian territories for indefinite time, but the company is going to possess the British Indian territories for a definite time period, and the time period was 20 years. So in this way, the British Parliament, it upheld the interests of shareholders. The monopoly rights of the East India Company was upheld. So this was much to the disappointment of the free traders. So the company continued to exercise monopoly rights with respect to trade with India and China. But in 1793, a major reform that was introduced was introduction of civil law. That is, a code of regulation was introduced. Prior to 1793, we saw that the East India Company came to acquire so many functions: administrative functions, political functions, revenue functions, and it experimented. Now, while the company was unable to administer Bengal, the company always found the subordinate Indian officials as scapegoats. Warren Hastings and other company officials, they always portrayed Indian character in poor light because they wanted to hide their own incompetence, inefficiency, incapability of administering Bengal. And when they highlighted this, that gave some form of a basis to evangelicals when they used to start saying that if you promote Christianity, if you convert them to Christianity, their moral and spiritual standard will rise. However, maladministration was always a major concern, and this maladministration was not so much because of the subordinate Indian officials, but it had much to do with the greed of the company's servants. In 1793, a code of regulation was to be brought about, and this also forms the basis to Cornwallis Code. Let us understand what is this code of regulation. Henceforth, the Governor General and his council was supposed to have written laws passed. All laws were to be written. They were to be translated in Indian languages. And these rules were to be handed over to various departments. Rights, immunities, All of them were listed in these rules. So in this regulation code, a specific set of rules, a body of legislation was introduced for the first time. So we saw for the first time in India, a civil law was passed by a secular human agency which was universally applicable. You have to always bear in mind that from 1793 till 1833, almost all the laws, they were passed as regulations. For example, 1829, abolition of sati is termed as Regulation 17, or Regulation of abolition of sati in Bengal. It is only after Charter Act of 1833 when a law member, Lord Macaulay, would be codifying laws, that all the laws, they would be called as acts. So prior to that, the Governor General and his council, they used to pass regulations. So Cornwallis Code was a set of laws, set of regulations that were introduced. So Charter Act of 1793 is very important because for the first time we see a system of civil law was introduced. Further, the Charter Act of 1793 is noteworthy for strengthening the control of Governor General over his council. That is, now the Governor General, he was made more effective over the council. Moreover, the Governor of Madras and Governor of Bombay, they were made subordinate to the Governor General in Bengal. The powers of Board of Control, they were more defined, more extensive. So we see over here with this particular background, the Board of Control came to have greater emphasis, greater influence, greater authority over the government in India. But the Charter Act of 1793, it did not in any way concede to the demands of the Benthamite reformers, nor did it concede to the demands of the evangelicals so as to promote Christianity. So the Charter Act of 1793 altogether can be understood as an attempt to further extend the authority of Board of Control upon the company, introducing civil law, strengthening the position of Governor General, and also continuing with the monopoly rights of the company. We have studied that after Charter Act of 1793 was passed, we will see advent of Lord Wellesley initiated the policy of subsidiary alliance, extending the territorial limits of the company. And the beginning of 19th century also witnessed rise of Napoleon. So rise of Napoleon in the continental Europe was also accompanied by further strengthening of industrial revolution in England and a gradual rise of the free traders, the bourgeoisie in England. Napoleon, he introduced continental system, via which the ports in Europe were closed for the British goods. Therefore, the free traders came to pressurize upon the parliament to open the trade with India. And the parliament had to concede, because gradually the ideas of Adam Smith of a free trade, free market economy was gaining acceptance in England. The laissez-faire model was gaining predominance amongst the intellectuals. And therefore, in the beginning of 19th century, an opinion was developing that there must be a permission given to the traders in England to trade with India. And this formed the basis to the Charter Act of 1813, which abolished the monopoly of East India Company. However, these shareholders, so we see free traders, they gained a massive victory in the Charter Act of 1813. However, the shareholders, they opposed this abolition of monopoly. They opposed it. They claimed that it would cause a loss to them. Therefore, the parliament, it declared a 10.5% dividend out of the revenue from India. And secondly, the parliament allowed China trade monopoly and monopoly in tea trade. So therefore, if you talk about the Charter Act of 1813, you have to bear two important developments or two important factors. One was the Napoleon's continental system, which necessitated opening up of Indian markets to the free traders, to the British traders. And second is the laissez-faire doctrine. And it ultimately led to the abolishing of monopoly of East India Company in the Charter Act of 1813. However, the British Parliament did a balancing act. In order to safeguard the interests of shareholders, the China trade was continued and monopoly in tea trade was also allowed. So the British Parliament in this way did a balancing act. Let's see the second component. Now evangelicals. Now these evangelicals, they had been pressing that the government must allow propagation of Christianity, Christian humanist. The company was not in favor of this. Why? The company believed that this might lead to objection against certain measures taken by the company. It was Charles Grant. Charles Grant, when he was a company's servant, and later when he became the president of Board of Control, Charles Grant wanted to allow Christianity or promote or enable the Christian missionaries to promote and propagate Christianity in India. And his measures, they gained success in the Charter Act of 1813 when Christian missionaries were allowed to propagate Christianity. So it was only after the Charter Act of 1813 that Christian missionaries, after taking the license from the Board of Control, they could carry out missionary activities in India. We all know about Brahmos Atmiya Sabha 1814, Brahmo Samaj, Socio Reform Movement. They were all after Charter Act of 1813. Because Charter Act of 1813, it also had one important provision. The Charter Act of 1813 stated, or it made it necessary for the company to keep 1 lakh rupee annually separate. So the company was required to set aside 1 lakh rupees annually so as to promote literature, native learned individuals, and sciences amongst the inhabitants in India. So when you talk about Charter Act of 1813, for the first time, it mentioned states' responsibility towards mass education. If we talk about the Orientalist Anglicist debate, which we will study in time to come, Macaulay's Education Minute, Macaulay's Minute, Wood's Dispatch, all of them, they could be traced to the Charter Act of 1813. And one way we can say that yes, Charter Act of 1813 also enabled, or it paved way towards some form of introduction of Western learning. Because it is via educational policy only that we will see that there would be exchange of ideas between the Indian intelligentsia and that of Western thought. So in this way, the Charter Act of 1793 and Charter Act of 1813, they were one of the very important legislations which led to formulating of socio-cultural policies in India.